September, turn 1217 AD. The leader of the Crusader faction commanded their troops to march on the medieval French city-state of Toulouse, expecting an easy victory. Though it was a large city with solid defenses, notably having successfully researched and built the medieval castle walls tech, several turns of instability in the server had stretched the Kingdom of France's military resources thin, leaving Toulouse with no allies willing to come assist in its defense. Last the Crusader player had heard, the player currently in control of Toulouse had only a small battalion of soldiers defending it. Yet when the Crusaders began their attack on the city, instead of a swift and unconditional surrender, what they encountered was fierce resistance. Though the actual military garrison defending Toulouse was small, it was home to tens of thousands of citizens, which the leader of Toulouse mobilized to defend the city. Now typically an untrained militia composed of civilians would get utterly decimated by an army of experienced soldiers. But not this time. The Crusaders' leader watched in horror as their most heavily armored knights were wiped out like they were nothing. This militia was armed with crossbows, the most overpowered military technology of the entire medieval era. Before we get into what made crossbows so OP, let's talk about their limitations. Crossbows were slow and cumbersome. As far as contemporary projectile weapons went, they had the slowest rate of fire by far. The longbow, the gold standard for medieval ranged units, could fire 12 arrows per minute. Crossbowmen would be lucky to get off more than one shot within that same time frame. The crank mechanism used to load the bolts required the user's full attention and could not be done on horseback, a massive mobility disadvantage compared to the longbow. But even for ground troops, crossbowmen were less mobile than longbowmen, as the weight of the crossbow and metal bolts made them difficult to run with. Crossbows also had less range than longbows. The shorter, heavier bolts lost momentum much more quickly than wooden arrows. And so the effective range of crossbowmen was barely more than half the effective range of longbowmen. So why was the crossbow so overpowered then? All these factors seem like they should be a pretty big deal on the battlefield. Is it just that the crossbow's base damage is that much higher? Well, while it isn't the only factor in the crossbow's favor, it is a big one. While crossbows have a shorter effective range, within this range they are devastatingly powerful. Now, to be honest, the power of single-target weapons have diminishing returns. Bolts dealing twice the damage of an arrow, or even more in some cases, doesn't really matter when a well-placed arrow can already one-shot basic infantry units. However, the medieval era was heavily centralized around the plate armor tech. This style of armor greatly hampered the wearer's mobility, but offered near total protection from arrows, so long as the archer didn't get lucky with a critical hit or anything. This made knights borderline unstoppable for quite some time, to the point where the only real counter to a knight was another knight. Previous anti-infantry tactics were simply not all that effective against them, as they could tank so much damage that players were starting to ignore longbowmen volleys when sending their units to attack points of interest. The crossbowman unit punished this tactic hard. At close to medium ranges, crossbow bolts had the armor-piercing ability, and could potentially one-shot a knight unit in full plate armor. But given the slow rate of fire, armor piercing alone is not enough to account for the overwhelming success crossbowmen saw in the meta. No, the true reason is an economic one, which brings us back to the battle at the start of the video. Simply put, crossbowmen were incredibly efficient for how effective they were. Now, to be clear, when I say efficient, I don't mean cheap. Crossbows themselves require much more complicated materials than other projectiles of the time. Longbows could be made from a single piece of hardwood and a string, something most players could generate even if their faction hadn't advanced very far on the tech tree. Crossbows, on the other hand, required composite materials and precise metalworking in order to create, making them both resource-intensive and gated behind multiple classical-era technologies. So in terms of equipment cost, crossbows were pricey, though still nowhere near as expensive as a full set of steel plate armor, the very thing they were so good at dealing with. But no, the real economic advantage was in the time it took to train a crossbowman unit. If a leader wanted to create an army of longbowmen, that is a project with a timescale on the order of years to decades. While the materials for the bows themselves were easy to come by, if your faction didn't have stable access to high-quality food, it's unlikely they'd be able to train the soldiers to have the strength required to be able to pull the draw weight of a powerful longbow. The training itself was intense and lengthy, requiring your state to have built barracks or military academies in order to produce the career sharpshooters capable of forming a troop of longbowmen. But for crossbows, this is entirely flipped. As long as your state had the required technology and resources to produce the crossbows themselves, training troops to be able to operate a crossbow in combat competently took only a few days at most. Physical conditioning and lifelong military discipline were no longer required. You could summon a force capable of repelling the onslaught of knights clad in state-of-the-art steel plate armor simply by handing out crossbows to mercenaries, conscripts, or a civilian militia. This is why the city-state of Toulouse was able to mount such a fierce surprise defense against the Crusaders. Even though they were too short on time to train up a professional defense force, simply arming the populace with crossbows proved effective enough. Because of the crossbow's long loading time, it is more effective as a defensive weapon, benefiting greatly from high ground, pre-constructed walls, and archer battlements. So, even though the attacking Crusaders had a few crossbowmen as well, the synergy of medieval castle walls and crossbowmen proved too much to overcome. Crossbows had existed for over a millennia before this particular example battle took place. In fact, the tech was first unlocked on the tech tree by the Chinese Empire during the Warring States period, but it wasn't until the blast furnace and steel metalworking techs were unlocked in the medieval Europe server that crossbows with the armor-piercing ability required to allow a civilian militia to thwart an army of knights could be manufactured. This tends to be the case with many powerful weapons, but we'll cover gunpowder in another video.